So I have the great privilege of working for Tearfund, and in my role at Tearfund, I work with churches all across the UK and globally. So I have the great privilege of hearing really lots of stories from the global church and the church from the UK. And part of my role involves me talking to lots of church leaders about their theology around engagement and best practice with engaging in poverty locally and globally. And I really love theology. I'm doing a master's with Nigel over there at WTC, doing it slowly, but I think that it's really important that theology underpins our thinking and our teaching and how we work with the churches. And I did previously lead a vineyard church. I've had quite a lot of experience over the years being involved in the church community. Interestingly, I'm also from Hastings, and I know Natalie, and I've known Natalie since I was about 14. And at first, when I heard that I was following Natalie, I thought, God, you've got a good sense of humour, starting the conference off with two women that come from Hastings. But as I was listening to Natalie, I was just reflecting really on coming from Hastings. Now, Hastings is a seaside town. It's quite a lot of it's quite deprived, there's a lot of drug problems, there's a lot of social issues. And Hastings wasn't the sort of town that everyone was running to go and live to get their kids into the best schools or the best jobs. That's not the sort of town that Hastings was when I grew up. In fact, when I grew up, there was a big tabloid newspaper, and at one point there were so many social problems in Hastings that a tabloid paper had the title Hell on Sea. And so I just thought it was quite humorous that God's starting the conference with two women that come from Hastings. And then actually I began to think, maybe this isn't a coincidence. Maybe this is a prophetic sense of God, because I know that God sometimes takes people and takes places that the world overlooks. And I think it's just really interesting that we're starting off both sharing with you about some of our experiences around poverty today. So I don't know what you'll think of this, but I started off my life as a little child. I was born into an Elim church, and then my parents moved, so we moved to a New Frontiers church, and then in my 20s I moved to a Vineyard church, and now I relocated and I'm in a HTB church. So I'm not sure what that says about me in terms of my commitment, but actually it's been a real privilege to experience some different networks and learn from many different churches and their networks and their theology, and each time I've taken some amazing learnings from the places I've been in. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of Tearfund, but I don't want to presume that everybody knows who we are as Tearfund and what we represent, so I'm just going to do a little recap for you. Some of you may know, but Tearfund started in, let me get this right, 1968. There was something called the Biafra crisis in Nigeria, where what happened was images of starvation and famine started flooding TVs all across England. And I still find this really remarkable because it was almost like a move of God around compassion and engaging with justice and global issues, because simultaneously, all across the United Kingdom, churches and Christians started just pouring money into the Evangelical Alliance. Nobody asked for it, no one suggested that lots of churches do it, but the Evangelical Alliance was literally flooded with a response from the UK church wanting to take action. And that became the Evangelical Relief Fund, which became Tearfund. And since then, we've had a real mission as a charity and an organisation to go where the need is greatest in the name of Jesus. So we do globally go to the most challenging places in the world. And our vision is to see an end to global poverty. Now, that vision does seem a bit huge, but actually over the last sort of even 30 years, the trajectory out of global poverty has been moving in a really encouraging direction. And there's been a real shift, and although there is still global poverty, it really has been shifting. Unfortunately, with what's been going on the last few years, we've been sliding back, but overall the trajectory has been really encouraging. I don't know again how many of you know this, but how we work at Tearfund is we train churches globally to be catalysts of change within their local community. And we call this, because we're really original at naming things, we call this church and community transformation, which we call CCT. And for my time at Tearfund, I've really seen this as the jewel in Tearfund's crown. It really is an amazing thing that we see global transformation in communities through the church. We partner with about 20,000 churches globally in about 50 different countries. And really, we feel that the church is at the centre of God's vision for the world. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit as I talk. So our main way of working is globally through the church, but we also do disaster response, which you may be more familiar with, and we do a lot of advocacy nationally and at global level around things like climate change, because we know it's pushing people into poverty. We speak on issues like sexual gender-based violence, and we do a lot of work around peace building where there's conflict. So I'm not going to massively go into the challenges. I know this conference is about understanding the challenges, but I just wanted to, put the context in and just highlight a few. Mark's already done an excellent job of really expanding what some of those challenges are. But actually, we've all faced them in the last few years, and some of them have been personal. I've got friends and colleagues that lost loved ones to COVID, and so there's been a number of people I know that have been really grieving during this season. I myself, I'm a single parent, and the cost of living crisis is a real challenge just to me keeping my household afloat. I began to tell my children that beans on toast is a delicacy, and they're really lucky, so they do have other food as well. And I tell them that we live on holiday because they're the luckiest kids in the world. Because we live in Hastings, they live on holiday all year round. So if you see my kids, please don't let them know that I'm slowly brainwashing them because they're quite happy with that at the moment. I know churches, I know it's been tough. I talk to church leaders day in and day out. I know it's been hard with the constant flux. And I know it's raised some real questions for us, like discipleship, like actually how good are people's roots really with Christ and discipleship, where so many people have actually, maybe some of them have even stopped coming to churches. The global situation we know is volatile, as is the national situation. I've got 3 children. I've got an 11-year-old. He's my youngest. I don't know if any of you are affected by this, but last week there was an issue that went around social media with a number of teenagers where kids were going into schools in gangs and literally smashing schools up. So last week, my 11-year-old was saying that a group of kids had gone in with baseball bats and were literally smashing up the school, causing hundreds of pounds worth of damage. I think this was a national thing rather than just the school I sent my kids to. But the reality is we're facing quite a lot of conflict and things that we're maybe not so familiar with. Obviously, we know about the war in Ukraine, plus as Tearfund, we've been responding to the situation in Syria, particularly after the Syria and Turkey earthquake. We know there's climate change, and we're on journeys of trying to get our heads around that. So as I'm talking to you today, I'm not going to go massively into those. We know that the context is complex, and we are living in that, and we are building churches and communities and charities in that context. So what I really want to do is ask some questions about that. So what do we do in the sight of all of these kind of contexts? Do we do the same thing we've always done? Do we have the mindset where we think, let's keep going, let's keep doing what we've always done, let's ride out these challenges? Or do we adapt and do we change? Or are there things we can maybe learn in this process? And as church leaders and different leaders in different organisations, we're probably at a bit of a mixture of figuring some of that out. But I just wanted to share a bit about Tearfund particularly because we've been working with the global church for decades, and we've been working with churches in extreme contexts of conflict, where there's been food scarcity, political conflict, and again we see actually churches grow and thrive and transform their communities in these difficult contexts. I had the great privilege yesterday of being with the whole of Tearfund, and all of our country directors globally are currently in the UK, and Nigel, our CEO, was sharing a bit about Tearfund's vision. And one of the things he said yesterday was, and I'm going to quote it because it's really good, he said, the church can be the most powerful change agent on the planet. And I think that's something, if our experience of really having like a global 360 at Tearfund, we see again and again the church being a powerful agent. Not that it can be, that it actually is being that. And I'm going to explore that in a little minute. Like I said, we call this this whole process that we've not just developed on our own, but with networks and other leaders and other organisations, church and community transformation. And we've kind of, we work through this process, which is facilitated, but it really empowers people to make changes in their own lives and overcome poverty. And like I say, we find that the local church, we believe, is the best placed organisation to overcome poverty in its local communities. And we see this working all the time. And so when we're faced in our context with very complex challenges, I think there's some learning and some thinking, and even thinking about how do the global church respond in these contexts. So I'm going to just share a few bits of learning from us. In 20 minutes, I can't go through all of it, but I'm just going to throw out some highlights and some things that might be useful, and any of you can chat to any of us about that if you want to know more. But the first thing I'm going to say, and it probably sounds a bit strange for me representing an international NGO to say this, but I think we're thinking about how to respond to conflict and challenges in our context. One of the first things I think is really important is the idea of mourning and lament, and listening and just hearing some of those stories. I don't know if it's going to come up, but there's a quote. I don't know if any of you have read this. I've been reading over the last few years, and I keep going back to it, The Emotionally Healthy Discipleship by Peter Cesario. I found that just so helpful in thinking about authenticity and how we really own the things we go through. And he says this: "We fail to realise that refusal to embrace our sorrows and grieve them fully condemns us and our churches to a shallow spirituality that blocks the work of the Holy Spirit in us. It contributes to the overall sense of superficiality in our own churches and a lack of profound compassion." And one of the things I want to talk a little bit today is actually just about listening and mourning and lamenting when things are difficult and things are broken. And I think actually in the UK church, I think we're really getting better at this. This isn't me telling to you all should be doing it. I think we're really understanding that before we rush into situations, or before we move on, or before we try and recover, we actually sometimes need to sit with things that are quite difficult. And when we do our church and community transformation process, a really important part of that is actually just listening and hearing people's stories and understanding the communities and the context they work in. I have the great privilege last year of being in Rwanda and meeting many of the facilitators and seeing this in action. And one of the things that I loved about the facilitators of church and community transformation is they just would go and listen and talk to people and build relationship and hear their stories. And out of that became something really beautiful in terms of people finding faith, finding community, and finding restoration in the church. On Sunday, I had again the great privilege of spending a day with our country director from Haiti, and we had a long car journey for about 4 hours together in the car, where I managed to ask him lots of questions. And I was just asking really, like, how is it being a Christian in Haiti at the moment? How is it as a leader of a church? And I just spent a lot of time just listening, and he was telling me how the context in there is so unstable that every single day that they leave their house, there is a genuine fear of kidnap. I think they've had about 1,900 people in the last year have been kidnapped because the government's so unstable and no one's actually stepping in. So there's lots of young people with guns, there's lots of gangs. And he was just talking about what it's like being a Christian in that context. He was talking about food scarcity, where sometimes they go to the shop and there just isn't the food. He was telling me how he did go to the market and he found a massive bag of flour that seemed to last them for ages. It was nearly all they had. And I was asking him about how his wife was, how his children were, and they've had some threats of kidnap even in their family. And I just spent the day just listening, trying to understand and trying to just lament and mourn and stand with somebody else and understand their situation. Because I think when we listen to people's stories, we've got a much better basis to build and make a difference from and recover from and move forward from. And so the other thing that we can do when we've done some listening is we can learn and we can discover. And one of the things I want to kind of pose to you all is actually we've got some things to learn And sometimes that means we've got some things to unlearn, and that can be uncomfortable. I think the Black Lives Matter movement just really revealed to us that actually there's some listening we need to do, and there's some blind spots maybe we've got in that context. But even as Natalie was talking about class, it's the same, isn't it? Actually, we need to do some listening. We need to understand what it's like for people from different walks of life and different experiences before we can kind of move forward in doing any action. Obviously at Tearfund we do a lot of work and thinking around poverty, and we've done a lot of really thinking about our theology around that. What actually do we mean when we talk about poverty? And at Tearfund we really frame poverty like this. We talk about poverty being broken relationships. Okay, so we talk about 4 broken relationships: our relationship with God, our relationship with ourselves, our relationships with others, and our relationship with the world. And we really think about poverty being about those 4 broken relationships. Now, this might seem like a little bit of a subtle shift in thinking. But one of the things we've experienced is that actually in the West, we have a very economic-centric view of what poverty is, okay? And so if we're not careful, starting believing poverty from that mindset creates very much an us and a them mentality, a bit like Natalie was referring to. And we really want to shift away from that because we think that we all have broken relationships. We all start off with a broken relationship with God. We have broken relationships in our lives, in our families. And I don't have long enough today to sit and tell you about some of the broken relationships in my own life, but I'll just highlight a few things that have been difficult. So when I was expecting my first child, which was 19 years ago, I know I don't look old enough, but I do have a 19-year-old. And I remember the day she was due, we got the sad news as a family that my 11-year-old brother had been unexpectedly killed in an accident. And as a family, we just had to weather that brokenness, that sense of loss, that sense of mourning. For me especially, I was just about to give birth to my first child. I had to cling on to God. I just said, God, I don't know how I'm going to get through this, but without you, please be in the middle of all of this. And, you know, you might have all been through that situation, but actually we've all had things in our life, whether it be mental health or physical health or people we know that we've lost, broken relationships. I stand before you as a divorced single parent with a just bloodbath of a story that I ended up leaving my family home and making myself voluntarily homeless with 3 children. And so, you know, my stories might be a bit extreme, but what we're trying to do as Tearfund is help us understand that actually we all have broken relationships. And although it's a subtle shift of thinking, I think when we begin to think like this, we no longer see it as us in the West. We've got more money than those people we help. We begin to see it actually as that we're in it together, that we all have different stories of brokenness, be it economic or health-wise or from relationships. And I think even just reframing our thinking of theology, of poverty, helps us to break down some of those dividing walls that Natalie touched on. And when I talk about broken relationships, it's not trying to be a shaming thing. What it is, it's actually a position of humility. And what I'm trying to encourage you today, and as Tearfund that we're trying to encourage thinking around, to really reposture ourselves in a position of humility, of listening to people's stories, of learning. Because often we have approached people, and whether it's locally or globally, we've often approached people with the assumption that we know what to do, or that we're going to fix it for people. But we really want to come from a different place of how can we listen, what can we learn, how can we understand, how can we discover. It's not uncommon for us to have conversations at Tearfund where people come up to us and say, we would like to build a school in Africa. And they've perceived a problem and they've assumed that they know what to do. And actually we have lots of conversations all across the UK about shifting mindsets on that. So we start from a different point with a different posture. I don't have enough time this morning to go through lots of stories with you, but we have many, many stories. Because this shift of mindset, not only do we need to shift our mindset, but also where we work with our country directors in different countries, they're on the same journey with shifting mindsets. So I was talking only yesterday to our country director in Burundi, and he was saying in Burundi, and this is quite common, that also some of the church community transformation is changing mindsets there. He said, because actually the mindset has been for a lot of years that an NGO is going to come in and fix it for everybody. Rich people are going to come in from the West and solve all their problems. So they're also working on changing mindsets to show people that they have skills, they're made in the image of God, that God can empower them to make a difference in their communities. And so through this process, not only are we shifting mindsets, but from that basis of humility and learning, we get people to reimagine and to dream. What can they have? What do they have in their hands? What can they do to make a difference? As I said, we're working in 20,000 churches globally, and these churches represent communities of people that have had individual changes. So when we hear stories of restoration, we often hear that they've come to faith, that they've joined a church community, that they have been empowered to often start businesses, and so they have much more dignity even in their own sense of self. Our vision at Tearfund is to see this, because we've seen it so successfully in transforming lives and communities. Our vision is to see this expanded to reach about 250,000 churches globally. We don't see that as a hard thing, because most of the countries we're working with, the country directors are having people knocking on the door saying, we can see this is working in your community, please can you help us do it in ours? But the other thing I'd say about Tearfund and the way we're working is this isn't something, I mean, obviously I'd love you to give money for Tearfund, but that's not why I'm here. We're here to give away free learning. So if you're involved in church planting, if you're involved in global churches locally, we want to help resource you so those churches aren't just meeting people's spiritual needs, but they're meeting holistic needs in the community. So please come and see us. We can give you resources, we can encourage you, we can show you what you've done. And we want to help you, because we know that the church is the greatest catalyst for change in its community. I've got a few examples. I'm just going to run through them really quickly. Like I said, I was in Rwanda last year, and I met one church, and there was about 300 people, the pastor said, that there was in his church. But through going through this process of empowerment within the community, his church grew to about 700 people, and all of the churches in the neighbouring communities all want to join in that process. So often churches are growing simultaneously. And the other thing we're seeing is because we're supporting people in a journey holistically, and often they're starting businesses and becoming more economically empowered, we often see that churches are growing significantly with tithes coming into their church. So one of the things we see again and again is communities building their own churches and their own health centres because they've started businesses, they've saved up money, they've tied to the local church, and they come together with their whole community to bring transformation. Now, I talk to church leaders, as I say, across the UK regularly about our work. And one of the things I've really learned is that there's a real heart in the UK to learn from this and also to bring some of this into their own churches. There's one church I'm going to tell you about in Lincoln called Alive Church Lincoln. And they were doing a lot of local community action. They had some great ideas and they kept doing some local community work. And what they realised was they had a heart for refugees. They started these refugee projects, and they realised that not many people coming, or the people that were coming from different parts of separate tribes that all hated each other, and they just kind of were finding they were getting in a little bit, they were well-meaning, but it wasn't really quite working. And so they decided to partner with us, and they came out to see some of our CCT work in action in Cambodia. And what it did was it really helped them learn to reframe their thinking as a church. And they decided to start from a different premise. Instead of starting from, we think we know what our community needs, they were just like, let's slow this down. Let's do some listening. Let's do some research. Let's really see what are the actual needs of our community rather than us thinking we know what they are. And when they did some research and homework and spoke to other organisations and asked a lot of people in their local community, they realised that actually one of the biggest needs in their community was actually there was a massive high suicide rate with young men, and they hadn't even been aware of it. And so then they came together with a number of churches in that city and said, how about together as churches, we come together and we have a church open every day of the week throughout the year. And now they have something, I think they call it a light on, I can't remember, they call it a light on in every church. And so they've really listened, they've understood what the needs are of their community, and they've responded to that. And they've done a little bit of learning from that, and with Andy as well, they've created a manual which is based a lot on Tearfund's way of doing development globally. It's called the 5 Ds of Community Transformation: discover, discern, discover, dream, design and deliver. And this has got stories from Tearfund, this has got stories from CAP, this has got stories from the local churches that have had a go of just reframing their way of doing local social action. So I just wanted to encourage you today that however difficult things are and whatever context we're living and working in, that we see all the time at Tearfund the church being central to the transformation of its local community. And there's learning from that from the global church, but there's also learning that we can take into our own contexts. Thank you.